Well, thank you very much for joining us on the next session. And it is a very special session in some ways because it's dedicated to health and healthcare. And of course, these are industries that not just can produce a good business case, but also can really change the lives of people in many ways. And for that, of course, Sabine and Christophe, you have years and years of experience. Of course, Sabine, you are the managing partner at Jeito Capital, and Christophe, you are the president and CEO of Takeda Pharmaceuticals. And on that note, considering, as I said at the beginning, the special thing about pharma is that, yes, it's a very large industry, but also there's so many challenges for people. You know, when you look at health, we're talking about issues like obesity, mental health problems. We're talking about cancer, obviously a terrible disease. There's all of these big questions out there. I wonder, however, when you look at the healthcare space for 2025, where are the innovations and the possible breakthroughs that make you excited as we enter the new year? And Sabine, if we can perhaps start with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It is indeed a fascinating place in which you can work, so meaningful, impacting dramatically patients' life. And if you consider, today still 2/3 of the diseases have no answer for the best of patients. So a fascinating place to be. Innovation is the growth driver in this industry. So at Jeito Capital, we are working on how you transform a great science into a real drug that you can administer and get access to from patients. So this is a very critical moment where you need, I would say, expertise and financing power. So where innovation will come from, I will start with something pretty obvious, research. And one example has been amazing during the last years is a better knowledge of immune system. In oncology, re-educating your immune system will teach it to fight the cancer cells. So you can cure people now. In autoimmune disease, where your system is killing healthy cells, there are a lot of innovation around how you re-educate your system, not to kill, to recognize healthy cells and not to kill them. So research is really key. But I would add, maybe in a more provocative way, two other drivers. Regulators can make a difference. For instance, if you take cardiovascular area, one of the leading causes of death still, the pharma industry was supposed to bring huge studies on mortality that really slowed down the innovation. So the regulators realized that innovation was slowing down because the cost of bringing those studies and the duration of those studies was not affordable for pharma industry. And they started to consider to register some drugs in what they call the surrogate endpoint, predictive endpoint of how your heart can work that will materialize into better mortality. Regulators can impact reopening of innovation. And the last one is about payers. You alluded to obesity. Obesity is a real disease now recognized by payers, and the fact that payers are considering to reimburse some drugs will really opened the field and kind of created that market. Unfortunately, in front of us, this huge pandemic. And maybe I will, for the future, another market will open around fertility, because all the big countries are facing natality problems, even in China, in Europe, in the US. So we will see what will happen in the future. So those for us can be the drivers of innovation.
And that's a fascinating point, and I'm happy you also mentioned fertility, because at times even the French president suggested, it seems there's a form of taboo around it, but it's affecting more and more people in modern society. And of course, demographics are key to growth and many other things. Christophe, the same question for you. I wonder, you go into 2025 as the start of a new year. It's obviously a business conference, but your industry not only just focuses on how to generate sort of revenue for shareholders, et cetera, but also potential breakthroughs that you may get in particular areas. Which are the ones that you're hoping to see?
Well, we are in an era of very strong innovation, because we know more biological targets more than ever before, exponentially. So and that started with the discovery of the human genome, and the number of targets that we have identified with potential impact on disease has quintupled in the last decade. So that's the first things is we understand better the biology, we understand better the target. We are in an era of very strong innovation because we have been able to really diversify the type of molecule that we can develop to interact with this biological target. So, 20 years ago, we mainly were using chemistry, small molecules, but now we are using peptides or RNA, antibody drug conjugates. So the diversity of modalities has increased a lot, and that goes along with the diversity of biological targets. So suddenly you have many more options to interact with biological target, and that's what is increasing the level of innovation. And then more recently, there will be technological innovation linked to digital devices that can be used with the molecules that we are developing. So wearable devices powered by AI will be able to monitor the status of the patient while they are using drugs. And that is opening a new era of understanding better the individual impact of the molecules on how it drives outcome and improve the treatment of the disease. So that's another area of innovation which is really, really promising.
And we're going to talk about artificial intelligence in just a second. But Sabine, if you don't mind, I want to focus on a specific point that you mentioned. You talked about regulation before and how regulation at times, there's always a gap in every industry between the innovation and the regulator. They're always behind. But in the health space, it's also complicated because you have to feed in public perception. They want to make sure that if they take a treatment, it's 100% clear that it will be beneficial with limited risks. Obviously, for governments and regulators, they don't want to take any risks either. But I wonder, from your perspective, is there a better way to do things?
It's a difficult question because I try to stay positive, showing how regulators can reopen doors in innovation. However, indeed, it's not always the case, and they have a tension, a very important tension with patients' demand, and more we see growing patient advocacy groups. It started many years ago with a benchmark in HIV, where patients' advocacy groups were so powerful that they were even invited with the big pharmaceutical company to discuss clinical development because they were so knowledgeable. So more and more we see indeed this pressure. And the problem, I would say, from the regulators is really about the balance benefits risk. You can never, in the disease in which we work, you can never have 100% safe product, which is very efficacious in very severe patients. So at Jeito, we work a lot about that balance benefits risk to find the first target population to accelerate access to market. And how? When you start with the most severe patients who have no option and no therapeutic option in the existing with the existing drugs, regulators are more open to consider some risks. In oncology, it's really so dramatic. So when you start with some patients who are at the end of the different lines of chemotherapy or radiotherapy or immuno-oncology, that's how you can indeed have fast track from the regulators, because then they would accept some risks. See the COVID vaccine. They accepted the COVID vaccine in 9 months, while it takes years to get a vaccine to the market and to the patient. So finding at Jeito, when you say about transforming an idea, science, into a real product, it's all about that. Understanding the symptoms, understanding the first target population that you will go for with the right value definition. So it's a lot about the benefits risk balance, because you cannot have 100% efficacy and zero risk. So it's all about that. And the new drugs are more and more niched with narrow population where the benefit should be huge.
And that's a very interesting point. And I wonder, Christophe, just briefly, if you would agree, because Sabine also mentioned the vaccine, and that's a perfect example that crystallizes how much money was thrown into this to try to develop a vaccine that was working effectively. The entire global economy was running on the back of this vaccine. The timing, which was put to market and mass produced, was very short. And then in this case, perhaps it crystallizes that in some areas, the balance could be different between the regulator and the put to practice. Would you agree that was exceptional, or could that serve as a lesson perhaps to how regulation can become more flexible also in the future?
Well, first, I would state that we need regulators in our area. So we need independent agency to establish with us that the medicine has an acceptable benefit-risk ratio. So it's part of the trust that has to occur around medicine and vaccine. So I am a strong advocate for strong regulator, a strong FDA, strong EMEA. It's very important because it's part. Again, we are in the healthcare, right? So we are touching the life of people. So we need this to establish this trust. And then, of course, science evolve, the way to measure efficacy evolve, and regulators have to modernize as we do. And we can learn a great deal from what happened during the pandemic vaccines. So there was a huge crisis. There was a need to react very quickly. And I think everybody worked together to make it happen. Does it establish a new way of working? I don't think so. Because
you think it's a one-off. It's exceptional moment.
Well, we learn from it. I think it has changed some perception. So it's not that it's a one-off and it's back to before. But on the other hand, this is, for example, 9 months. This is not the new benchmark to approve vaccines, right? We just had vaccines against dengue approved, and we were requested to provide 5 years of clinical efficacy. And that was after COVID, you see what I mean? But on the other hand, we learned that there might be different way of measuring this benefit-risk ratio in a more dynamic way, in a faster way.
And it's a fascinating industry, clearly. And Sabine, I wonder, however, you mentioned before to me, there is the idea of very good science, and obviously that's where the innovation would come. But that's not really of great use if you cannot make a great treatment after. There needs to be a form of connection. How do you make that connection? Is it about funding? Is that ultimately the question?
Not only, but indeed, in our world of financing and investment, you have the VC funds who intervene earlier to define the candidate, the drug candidate, and start what we call the preclinical, meaning all the studies in animals, where they try to control safety. And then the agencies, very important indeed, are authorizing you to enter into human and into patients. That's where Jeito believes is making a difference, because that's where indeed you have to design the clinical development plan in order to get access at the best way. And I would say at Jeito we do have a specificity. In this market, you have a trend, I would say, which is very different from other markets, which is that we have strategic acquirers named Takeda. The big pharma.
For example, not exclusive. Huh?
So I have to care, because he may be one of my customers tomorrow, to care for Christophe. What's happening? Those big pharmas, Takeda, others of course, are facing huge patent cliff. Because in this industry, economics are good, but when you lose patent, you lose enormous part of your business, and this is so predictable. Big pharma are all mapping when they will lose patent. So it's interesting to see that the big pharma know that they will lose huge patent. Between now and 2030, they will lose 300 billion of revenue. 300 billion, can you imagine? So they have their internal research, hopefully, that is providing part of the pipeline of innovation, but it is not enough. Because the big drugs now, the big drugs in oncology, the big drugs in autoimmune are per year over 10 billion turnover. But when we lose one of those, it's an enormous cliff. So they have to go outside and to acquire younger company. And we hope at Jeito to be able to shape the companies, to prepare them And how are we going to do that? I will tell you in a minute, so that the big pharma can acquire at a certain point on the right value creation to fulfill their pipeline of innovation. Again, I think the CEOs, maybe, and I will tell you from where I come, I know a little bit what's happening in big pharma. They are obsessed by maintaining the pipeline of innovation in their own company. So they have internal and they have external. So that's exactly where Jeito is positioned. And interestingly enough, our founder, who is coming from investment, who is a medic, Raphael Torgman, invited people like me to understand, and I'm coming from J&J, from Johnson & Johnson. I'm the acquirer. So at Jeito, not only we shape the clinical development, but we try to do it with the mindset, with the tools, with the demanding quality standards that big pharma will recognize when one day, hopefully, they will acquire those companies. So that's how we contribute to fulfill the pipeline on innovation, because in the model, big pharma are far more equipped to launch, commercialize, and give the right access afterwards. So that's very specific to Jeito. It's a combination of financing power and of very special expertise coming from big pharma most of the time.
And on that note, Christophe, if I may ask you, when you look at pharma, at times there can be a perception that there is a lot of funding for specific treatments, but other treatments do not get the funding that perhaps they should merit. Do you think there's a better equilibrium in terms of how funding is provided in the relationship between companies, big pharma, but also maybe there's a role to play too of the public sector too?
Sure. I think first to explain a little bit the research ecosystem. So you have first public research, fundamental research. That's where you discover the type of biological target I was talking about. Then you design molecule to interact with these targets, and then you do the clinical testing. So you test the medicines first in animals, then humans. The human testing is the longest and the most expensive part. And it requires actually a lot of expertise.
Just how expensive can it be? Just so we get a sense, because sometimes it's difficult to put these numbers, but it's enormous.
It varies a lot by disease and by molecule, because with some disease you need to do a clinical trial which will last 6 months. But in some disease you will need to do a clinical trial which will last 5 years. And so it's a completely different cost depending on the disease and the molecules. But I think what I want to stress is that the expertise you need to be able to design these clinical trials is very unique. That's why, for example, at Takeda, we are investing in research and development only in 3 disease areas: in neuroscience, in oncology, and in gastroenterology and inflammation. Our R&D budget is $5 billion per year, and this is about what we can do. The domain of research is much more vast than that, but you need to select where you want to play, because in every disease area we have PhD doctors, we have teams specialized in this area. They are the one who understand the disease, the patient, and who can design this development. The industry, on average, invest about 20% of its revenue in research and development. This is one of the highest ratio. And yes, you cannot do everything. You need to prioritize which molecule you want to develop. It's not only you do that based on many different parameters: technical, scientific, market, how competitive is the market? Are you first? Are you behind? What is the profile of the molecule? It's a very difficult choice, actually. But you have to prioritize, because you cannot do everything, and that's you make a lot of mistakes along the way, and because even in late stage, you will have 30% attrition. In the late stage, early stage, you are like 80% attrition, but even in the late stage, when you are in the last stage of development, the attrition is still about 30%.
So it's a big risk that you take. But Christophe, if I may ask you, obviously you have years of experience in this sector, but to me, it's interesting when we talk about pharma and the healthcare space, there's a lot of optimism at times for the future. There's a lot of possibilities too. The budgets, they can seem to the public opinion enormous. And yet, when you look at the situation, not to be controversial, but I think we should mention this, of, public hospitals, budget cuts going into health, staff that say we are not getting paid enough and we feel burnt out in some way. How can you reconcile the two? Because ultimately, the staff, they implement what you create.
Well, that's the biggest challenge today of healthcare, is the financing of healthcare. Healthcare is, in developed countries, the cost of healthcare is between 11 to 20% of GDP, 11% in, let's say, UK, 20% in the US. This is in Europe, this is public finance. In US, it's mixed public and private. So it's a very different market mechanism. It's not in many industrial markets or product markets, the market is driven by innovation and by growth, by demand. In healthcare, the market is driven by actually today is driven by financing capability. And that's my biggest concern, is that we are at a point where there are more options, there are more innovation, still many diseases to treat, people live longer. That doesn't come cheap. There is some good data showing that anyone who beyond 65, the average cost on a healthcare on average when you are beyond 65 is 4 times higher than when you are at 45. So while the population is aging, the cost is increasing. So how do you finance that? And this is the biggest challenge today. So we can bring a lot of new innovations, but if the financing doesn't follow, you create rationalization. And whether it is a collective rationalization like in Europe or an individual one, more individualized one like in the US, that's the biggest issue.
It's fascinating that the question of demographics seems to continuously now come up in almost every major economic conversation. There's another question that also comes up a lot and has come up in a lot of these sessions in this conference, which is the artificial intelligence and the role that it would play. I'm particularly curious to, figure out if in this specific sector, which is health, the consumer will prefer what they perceive as man-made or the machine. So I wonder, how do you see AI impacting this industry? And perhaps start with you, Sabine.
I start because maybe I will start a bit narrow and Christophe can elaborate further. Again, at Jeito, we are not working in the modeling of the molecules, where artificial intelligence can be used to get the best molecule out of different options. We are more, for us, it's an enabler to make the clinical development, that huge financing moment, more predictable, and with the right definition of the predictable subpopulation that can have more benefits relatively to the risks. So there are now some companies that we are recommending our portfolio companies to use, which are helping in designing in the best way, so to go faster to the patients with lower cost, in a more efficient way, designing with a lot of experience, accumulating this experience that we have now, the best subpopulation that will be predictable for the huge population. That's one of the big challenges. We also recommend other companies which are helping to define the sites, the hospitals in which you will make your studies in the best way. So in other words, when I started my career, we had that review of the literature. We had young people, PhDs, brilliant, who were able to do that. It's impossible now. It's too big. So only computers can help you to review everything which exists. So for us, again, because we are in clinical stage, we do recommend use of artificial intelligence in how to lower the price and make more efficient and more quick the clinical development, and how you choose the sites as well. And it's interesting to see that at least we have some companies, enablers, which are recognized by FDA now. FDA accepts to use them and to discuss the right protocol. So it's a great recognition. Again, regulators here are opening some doors.
So if I understood correctly, it mostly comes down to the clinical stage where you believe
that's where
AI can be beneficial and will bring down costs.
Yeah. And fast, rapidity and cost. That's a big challenge. And predictability.
And Christophe, obviously you're in a perhaps different part of the sector. How do you believe it can play a role? Because it's a real debate.
Totally transformative. So we are using AI, for example, to accelerate diagnosis of disease. Many the diseases are not well diagnosed, or it takes many years to get diagnosed. So, for example, we developed an algorithm to analyze sleep patterns when we record sleep, which will allow faster diagnosis of a disease called narcolepsy, because we could correlate some sleep pattern with that disease, for example. Impossible to do without machine learning. So diagnosis will be completely changed. We are dealing with big data in the industry, so when you have the big data, you can have machine learning or algorithm to help you. So we are using it now in research, molecule design, toxicity modelization before we do animal tox, for example, in development to optimize protocol based on population data. We are using it a lot in manufacturing. For example, it's completely transforming our manufacturing operation. So our goal is to completely change our level of productivity, which hopefully will allow us to continue to grow as a company in an environment I was mentioning earlier where financing is tough. And that's really a key for our survival, actually.
The transformative. And just as a final question, of course, at the start of the session, we talked about perhaps many of the issues. It's a time where we talked about the idea of aging is not going to be cheap. And we're facing a moment in history where actually you really do see the real implication of an aging population vis-a-vis one that is younger potentially, but not having as many children as possible, and there's an imbalance in that way. There's also the idea of infertility that we mentioned. We talked about obesity. That's a real problem too for public healthcare. But I wonder, to end on a positive note, perhaps, what still makes you optimistic about the idea that you can still make meaningful changes to people's lives? Because that is what's so particularly about this industry. A real breakthrough can really save lives.
Yeah, I'll start and leave Christophe with the last word. Working in healthcare is so meaningful. We see when we hire people, they don't have to look for meaning, purpose, because you really transform patients' life. And just a comment, if it's not transformative, you never get reimbursement, you never get economic, business. So it should be transformative. That's why the attrition rate are so high and the risk is high. And the reward should be at the level of the risk. If not, that will stop. What makes me so proud is to contribute to better health for patients who are or dying or with terrible lives today. And I think that the conjunction of actors coming together, this ecosystem, will definitively continue to progress. Oncology has been transformed by new drugs. Totally transformed. And you have people now who are cured for cancer, who were dying 10 years ago. So we have in front of us huge progresses. Maybe a personal note, still a lot to do in neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson and the famous Alzheimer. This is still, we didn't crack the brain yet. Maybe it's good news, because that's really where humanity may stay, but that's the next frontier, I believe. But when you speak about patients, when you speak about heavy symptoms, and not only patients, caregivers, families, society, the impact of some drugs can be huge, and that's really what drives me so proud of being here.
And Christophe, what about you? Because ultimately, I think everyone can agree it's not about living longer. No one just wants to live longer. Or perhaps yes, then we enter a very philosophical debate. But there's also a question of living longer, but also living better. Are we going to be in a situation realistically where in 20, 30 years, we're going to see that reflected in people's health? That's ultimately the question.
Well, I think that's a promise. I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to live longer, healthier. So it's healthy longevity. We need to achieve a healthy longevity. And I think that's where the society will benefit the most. Because if you are healthy and you live longer, you can remain active as well. And I think this is what we all should strive for. I think we'll get there. We have today the life expectancy has increased by 20 years in the last 50 years, and we are living healthier as well. But there are still many issues: mental health, neurodegeneration, you name it, oncology, cancer. But take Alzheimer or dementia. The same will happen with Alzheimer than what happened in cancer. 20 years ago, there was like 5 types of cancer. Now there are 400. There will be many types of subpopulation of dementia, and there will be targeted medicines to get those. It will take time, but that's where we'll go. And then suddenly you live healthier, longer. And that's why my plea is to see healthcare investment as a good investment for the society. You invest in healthcare, you live healthier and longer. I think that's how a modern society will thrive in the future.
And if we do the maths of what you said, it means the next frontier will be added 20 years of life expectancy. It means 100 is going to be much more common than we think it is. I'm not sure how we feel about that.
I don't know how long we will go in terms of life expectancy. I don't know. I have talked with a lot of experts. It's difficult to predict. But today, the majority of the people living until 100 are not healthy. And I think this is really what we need to thrive for. Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
We'll continue the next session.